At 8:47 p.m., a private jet touches down on a quiet Paris runway, and in that moment, the most dangerous programmer on Earth becomes just another man in handcuffs. He isn't accused of stealing money, leaking secrets, or planning violence. His crime is far simpler and far more threatening. He refused to cooperate. For nearly 2 decades, governments told him the same thing in different languages, and legal codes just give us the data. And every time he answered with the same word, no. That single refusal cost him his country, his company, his safety, and eventually his freedom. But it also built the most powerful weapon ordinary people have ever had against surveillance. This is not a story about an app. It's a story about what happens when one individual decides that privacy is not negotiable, even when the entire system is designed to break him. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Modern control doesn't start with soldiers or secret police. It starts with paperwork, compliance requests, and reasonable demands framed as security. Most people sign, most companies comply. One man didn't. And in doing so, he triggered a chain reaction that exposed how fragile power really is when it depends on obedience. Governments tried to buy him. When that failed, they tried to isolate him. When that failed, they tried to erase him legally, quietly, procedurally. And yet today, nearly 1 billion people communicate through something they cannot shut down. This story asks a question every viewer eventually has to face when authority demands access to your life. At what point do you stop cooperating? And what does it really cost to say no? Long before governments feared him, Pavel Durov was simply obsessed with one idea: removing friction between people. He didn't see technology as entertainment or branding. He saw it as infrastructure: roads, wires, nervous systems. While others chased features, he chased speed. While competitors argued about monetization, he argued about milliseconds. His rule was brutal and absolute. If an action required more than 2 clicks, it didn't belong. Complexity was not intelligence, it was weakness. What emerged from that mindset wasn't just a successful platform, but something far more dangerous: a digital space people trusted. Not because it promised safety, but because it stayed out of the way. No banners shouting for attention. No algorithms nudging behavior. No hidden levers quietly shaping opinion. For users, it felt invisible. For power, it was intolerable. As the platform spread, it stopped behaving like a company and started behaving like a country. Tens of millions relied on it not to be entertained, but to coordinate their lives, classes, friendships, movements, beliefs. And Durov understood the implication before anyone else did. Once communication becomes centralized, control becomes inevitable. So he designed against it. He rejected advertising not as a moral stance, but as a structural one. Ads create dependency, and dependency invites influence. He refused outside oversight because oversight eventually asks for favors. Every design decision pointed in one direction: autonomy first, consequences later. That philosophy hardened into something colder as the numbers grew. When the platform crossed from millions into tens of millions, Durov stopped seeing users as an audience and started seeing them as a responsibility. Data was no longer abstract. It was people's locations, relationships, private thoughts typed at 2 a.m. He understood a truth most founders avoid: the moment you collect data, you inherit moral liability for what happens to it. And once governments realize you have it, they will come not loudly, not violently, but politely. This is where his method diverged from everyone else's. He didn't believe in negotiating with power. He believed in designing systems that made negotiation unnecessary. Control couldn't be debated away, but it could be engineered out. And in quietly building a platform that answered only to its users, he unknowingly crossed a line no one was allowed to cross. He created power without permission. The first approach never sounds like a threat. It never announces itself as coercion. It arrives dressed as responsibility. A phone call, a letter, a meeting for clarification. The language is always calm, reasonable, almost apologetic. National security, public safety, stability. Words designed to make refusal feel irresponsible rather than dangerous. And for most companies, that framing works. Data is handed over quietly, wrapped in legal justifications and non-disclosure agreements buried so deeply that no one ever knows a line was crossed. Durov understood something that few founders are willing to say out loud. Data is not neutral. It's not an abstract asset or a line item on a balance sheet. It's a map of human behavior. An address is a door someone sleeps behind. A contact list is a social circle that can be pressured. A message history is a timeline of fear, trust, and intent. Once data leaves your control, it doesn't just move, it transforms. It becomes leverage. When authorities began asking for access, the requests followed a familiar pattern. They weren't asking to shut anything down. They weren't demanding censorship. They wanted cooperation, names, messages, metadata. Just for a few accounts, just to prevent unrest, just this once. Durov saw the trap immediately. Compliance wouldn't end the pressure, it would formalize it. The first handover wouldn't be the last. It would be the precedent. Instead of negotiating in private, he did something radical. He documented everything. Calls were recorded, requests were archived, and when the pressure crossed a line, he dragged it into the light. Publishing government demands wasn't theatrics, it was strategy. He understood that secrecy protects institutions, not citizens. Once exposed, the requests lost their bureaucratic camouflage. People could hear the tone, read the wording, see how casually leves were discussed as variables in a security equation. That transparency changed the nature of the conflict. This was no longer one company dealing with regulators behind closed doors. It became a public confrontation over who truly owned user data, the platform, the state, or the individual. Each disclosure sharpened the stakes. Supporters applauded the courage, authorities recalibrated. Because while governments can tolerate defiance, they cannot tolerate exposure. Behind the scenes, the tone shifted. Requests became firmer. Deadlines appeared. Legal language hardened. What began as cooperation turned into expectation. And expectation, once unmet, becomes suspicion. Durov wasn't being accused of breaking the law. He was being treated as someone who refused to play his assigned role. This chapter of the story is quiet, but critical. No arrests, no dramatic raids. Just a realization settling in on both sides. The data exists, the state wants it, and the man holding it will not yield. From that moment forward, the question was no longer if the pressure would escalate, but how far the system was willing to go to reclaim control over information it believed should never have been out of reach. When direct pressure fails, power doesn't retreat. It changes form. There are no sirens, no midnight raids, no public accusations. Instead, the conflict moves into boardrooms, legal documents, and financial structures so complex they feel almost invisible. This is how modern systems neutralize resistance, not by force but by absorption or removal. The platform's growth had crossed an unspoken threshold. It was no longer just influential, it was essential. And essential infrastructure is never allowed to remain independent for long. Ownership began to shift quietly. Stakes moved through shell companies. Friendly investors were replaced by strategic ones. Board seats changed hands without headlines. On paper, everything was legal. In reality, control was being transferred away from the one person who refused to cooperate. This is the moment where many founders compromise. They convince themselves that partial control is better than none, that survival inside the system is preferable to exile outside it. Durov didn't make that calculation emotionally, he made it structurally. He understood that once governance changes, principles follow. The system doesn't need to rewrite your code, it only needs to rewrite who has authority over it. The final move was surgical, a board vote, a resignation he never submitted, an exit package framed as generosity but layered with implication. Sign quietly, leave peacefully, accept the money, and disappear. The message beneath the paperwork was unmistakable. Resistance is tolerated only until it becomes inconvenient. What makes this escalation chilling is its professionalism. No one raises their voice. No laws are openly broken. The machinery works exactly as designed. And that's the point. In modern power structures, the most effective weapon isn't repression, it's legitimacy. If the process looks clean, the outcome feels inevitable. But inevitability cuts both ways. While the system believed it was closing a chapter, Durov was executing something else entirely. The removal wasn't a defeat, it was a release. Control had been taken, but commitment had not. Loyalty followed people, not titles. The core team had already moved. The groundwork had already been laid. What looked like capitulation was in fact separation. This chapter marks the irreversible shift in the story. The conflict is no longer about compliance or negotiation. It becomes existential. The state has reclaimed the platform, but in doing so, it has lost the architect. And systems rarely understand the danger of that trade until it's too late. Because when you remove the person who refuses to bend, you don't eliminate resistance. You export it. And what comes next is no longer contained within a single company, a single country, or a single legal framework. The escalation is complete. The fight has changed arenas. The new platform works. That's the cruel irony. It grows faster than anyone predicted, spreads across borders with no headquarters to raid and no single law to exploit. From the outside, it looks like victory, but the man behind it begins to disappear from ordinary life. Success does not bring stability, it removes it. Every new user increases the target on his back. Every headline turns mobility into a necessity rather than a privilege. There is no home anymore, only locations. 5-star hotels replace addresses. Private flights replace routines. Friendships thin under the strain of secrecy. Relationships fracture when permanence becomes impossible. The wealth is real, but so is the surveillance. He can cross borders, but he never truly arrives. The freedom he protected for others becomes something he cannot afford for himself. Governments shift tactics again. The language changes. This time, it isn't about censorship or control. It's about responsibility, liability, harm prevention. The accusation is subtle but powerful. By refusing to moderate aggressively, by refusing to build back doors, he is accused not of committing crimes, but of allowing the conditions for them to exist. It's a theory that turns principle into guilt and integrity into negligence. Democratic institutions now take the lead, and that complicates the story. These aren't secret police or authoritarian regimes. These are courts, prosecutors, regulations written in careful legal language. The threat no longer looks like repression. It looks like due process. And that's what makes it dangerous. When punishment wears the mask of legality, resistance becomes harder to justify and easier to isolate. The personal toll becomes unavoidable. He lives with the knowledge that every move is logged, every conversation potentially monitored, every mistake magnified. Safety becomes conditional. Presence becomes a risk. He hasn't lost his voice, but he has lost the ability to be ordinary. This is the cost rarely discussed in stories about defiance. Not martyrdom, not prison, but a permanent state of alertness, a life where victory means endurance rather than peace. The platform thrives, the principles hold, but the man who refused to cooperate pays in something money can't replace: anonymity, stillness, and the simple luxury of not being watched. Freedom remains intact. Comfort does not. What ultimately survives this story is not a man or even a platform, but a principle that proved unexpectedly contagious. The system believed power flowed downward from institutions to individuals, from laws to obedience. What it underestimated was how quickly refusal could scale. Once people saw that a single no could hold, they began to question every demand they had accepted as inevitable. The platform becomes something rare in modern history: neutral ground. Not owned by a nation, not shaped by an ideology, used by people who share almost nothing except the need to speak without permission. Journalists rely on it to protect sources. Families use it to cross borders quietly. Protesters coordinate when every other channel is compromised. Soldiers share information that saves lives. None of these users agree with each other. What unites them is trust earned not through promises, but through consistency under pressure. Every attempt to dismantle this system backfires. Bans turn into tutorials. Court cases turn into advertisements. Each accusation confirms what users already suspect: if something provokes this much fear from power, it must be doing something right. Over time, the narrative flips. The question is no longer why privacy matters, but why it was ever treated as optional. The man at the center fades into the background by design. He does not campaign. He does not ask for loyalty. He does not claim moral authority. His absence becomes part of the legacy. The system runs without him in the spotlight, which is precisely the point. If the idea can't survive without its creator, it was never a threat to begin with. This is where the story leaves biography and enters history. It becomes a reference point, a reminder that systems depend less on force than on participation. You don't have to overthrow them to weaken them. Sometimes the most disruptive act is simply to stop cooperating, to design to live and to decide as if permission were never required. In the end, the legacy isn't technological, it's psychological. A quiet shift in what people believe is possible. One refusal didn't change the world overnight, but it proved something lasting. Power that relies on compliance is far more fragile than it wants you to believe. In the end, this story isn't really about technology or Russia or even one man. It's about a choice every society eventually faces: convenience or conscience, safety or freedom, compliance or integrity. Systems don't become dangerous overnight. They become dangerous when no one says no. Pavel Durov's story reminds us that power depends on participation, and that refusing to cooperate can still matter, even when the odds are overwhelming. Privacy isn't a luxury for the guilty. It's a safeguard for everyone. If this story made you think, hit like. If you believe more people need to hear it, share it. And if you want more investigations like this, subscribe.